They told us the writs were mercy before we learned to read them. I was 6 years into the administratum when I understood what the seals actually approved. By then, my hand had already signed 2,000 conversions, and the system had a word for anyone who hesitated: inefficient. The writ arrived in the morning prayer bell, sealed in brass and older than the hand that carried it. I sat in a recessed alcove within the third stratum of the Heathguard Minor Manufactorum Compliance Annex, beneath a ceiling vaulted high enough that incense smoke gathered in permanent clouds. The desk before me was iron, the surface worn smooth by centuries of forearms resting in the same position mine occupied now. A cogitator terminal hummed to my left, its screen flickering with columns of labor output metrics. To my right, stacks of parchment rose in ordered towers, each sheet bearing the embossed seal of the administratum, each awaiting verification, countersign, and placement into the eternal record. My role was Lex Mechanic Auditor, 3rd class, assigned to a 72-hour audit cycle that began at dawn and would conclude 3 rotations hence. The work was devotional. The forms were prayers made manifest. I verified tithe compliance across labor pools, ensuring the manufactorum's flesh quota aligned with production demand. The numbers told stories of sacred efficiency. The Emperor's work performed through flesh that had been properly allocated. The servitor that delivered the writ moved with the fluid precision of purpose without thought. Its face had been replaced by a brass plate embossed with the Mechanicus cogtooth. The arms that extended the document toward me terminated in digits too uniform to have been born rather than installed. I accepted the writ without meeting what remained of its gaze. Gratitude was unnecessary. It had already turned away before I could speak, its task complete, its existence justified by that singular delivery. The writ itself was a standard servitorization authorization, 3rd degree, categorical processing. I recognized the format before reading the contents. The parchment was thick, fibrous, treated with oils that would prevent decay for millennia. The seal at the bottom was layered not a single impression, but dozens, each applied atop the last, creating a topography of approvals that rose from the page like scar tissue. I could make out at least 17 distinct stamps, the oldest so compressed beneath newer applications that only fragments of script remained visible. The name was listed in a narrow column on the upper left. Harrow, J. Labor Classification, Manufactorum Assembly, Line Theta 9. Crime Code, 447.3, Inefficiency, Persistent, Recommended, Disposition, Servitorization, Category 2, Motive Function Restoration. I cross-referenced the serial against my audit logs. The cogitator returned Harrow's productivity record within seconds. The numbers appeared in crisp green script across the black screen. Daily output, 112% of quota. Weekly aggregate, 109%. Monthly average, 111%. Every metric exceeded baseline expectation. I read the figures twice. Then I checked the crime code again. Inefficiency, persistent. The discrepancy was minor, a clerical variance perhaps, the kind of error that resolved itself within properly maintained systems. I had been taught that doubt was the first symptom of pride, the assumption that one's limited perspective could perceive flaws in mechanisms designed by minds far greater and more ancient. The Munitorum did not make mistakes of this nature. If the writ declared inefficiency, then inefficiency existed, measurable in ways my narrow station could not encompass. I prepared the counter seal. The brass stamp rested in a wooden case to my right, its handle worn to a dull shine by generations of hands. I lifted it, felt its weight, and aligned the base with the designated approval field at the document's lower margin. The wax was already soft, kept warm in a small brazier that burned sacred oils. I poured a measure onto the page, watching it spread into a perfect circle. The act of pressing the seal should have been automatic. I had performed it thousands of times across my service. The motion required no thought, only the application of even pressure for 3 seconds, then a clean withdrawal to prevent smearing. My hand hesitated. Not in refusal, not even in doubt. The hesitation was recognition, the realization that my involvement was ceremonial. The writ bore stamps dating back centuries, approvals granted long before Harrow was born, perhaps before the current sector governor had assumed office. The language was templated. The crime code selected from a list so ancient that its origins were recorded only in Mechanicus data temples. My countersign would not authorize this conversion. It would simply acknowledge that the conversion had already been determined, decided, and sanctified by systems far older and more comprehensive than my comprehension. I pressed the seal. The wax accepted the impression without resistance. I held it for the prescribed 3 seconds, then lifted. The administratum eagle emerged in perfect relief, wings spread, the scroll of compliance clutched in its talons. I placed the stamp back in its case and returned the writ to the outgoing stack. A servitor would collect it within the hour. Harrow would proceed to intake. The manufactorum's efficiency would improve by 1 unit of corrected flesh. The morning bell rang again, marking the 2nd hour of my shift. I turned back to my cogitator and began processing the next series of labor verifications. The columns of data scrolled upward in steady rhythm. The numbers were clean, the quotas balanced, everything functioned as designed. I did not think about Harrow again until the observation requirement arrived 3 hours later. The manufactorum's architecture enforced devotion through scale. Corridors stretched beyond the limits of vision, lit by lumen strips that turned flesh pale and shadows absolute. The walls were iron, stamped with litanies in Gothic script too small to read individually but overwhelming in aggregate. Prayers covered every surface. The air tasted of sacred oils, of metal heated past comfort, of incense burned in quantities sufficient to obscure the presence of 10,000 laborers working in shifts that blurred together into a single, eternal rotation. I had worked within this structure for 6 years. I knew its rhythms. The morning bell summoned first shift. The noon bell marked the meal ration. The evening bell signaled transition. Between these markers, the manufactorum breathed with mechanical consistency. Every intake of raw material matched by an exhalation of completed product. Servitors moved through the halls in silent columns, their augmetics clicking in synchronized cadence. Human workers walked more slowly, burdened by thought, by fatigue, by the weight of choice not yet removed. The catechism of usefulness was recited at the beginning of every shift. I had heard it 10,000 times. I could recite it in sleep, in prayer, in the moments between waking and true consciousness. The words had become part of my internal voice, indistinguishable from my own thoughts. Flesh serves best when it no longer chooses. The Emperor's will flows through surrender. Suffering ends where function begins. Waste is the only sin the Imperium cannot forgive. The Catechism offered comfort. It removed the burden of moral ambiguity. Every servitor I passed in the corridors had been saved from the greater cruelty of uselessness. Every conversion was an act of mercy. The Mechanicus did not destroy souls, it perfected them, stripping away the confusion of individuality and replacing it with pure, unwavering purpose. I believed this. I had to believe it. The alternative was to accept that my work contributed to something monstrous, and I was not strong enough to carry that understanding while still performing my duties. The observation galleries were located in the northern annex, accessible by a lift that descended 4 levels below the primary audit chambers. The summons had arrived via data slate, a terse message requiring my presence to verify intake numbers against processed writs. Standard procedure during audit cycles. The Mechanicus demanded visual confirmation in addition to data reconciliation, a redundancy that acknowledged the sacred fallibility of human record-keeping. I entered the lift alongside 2 robed tech priests, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks that hissed with each exhalation. They did not acknowledge my presence. I did not expect them to. We descended in silence, the lift's cables groaning with the strain of vertical transit. The temperature dropped as we moved deeper into the manufactorum's substructure. My breath misted slightly. The tech priests did not breathe visibly. Their augmetics regulated temperature without the inefficiency of shivering. The doors opened onto a corridor lined with observation windows. Each window looked down into a processing chamber where intake procedures occurred in ordered sequence. I approached the 3rd window from the left, the one corresponding to my assigned audit sector. A brass placard beside the frame read, "Categorical processing, theta assignments, hourly intake verified." The chamber below was clean, clinically clean. The floor was white tile, scrubbed until it reflected the lumens above. Restrained frames lined the walls in neat rows, each frame occupied by a figure in gray penitent robes. The robes were identical, shapeless, designed to erase distinction. I could not tell gender from this distance. I could barely distinguish one figure from another. A Mechanicus adept moved between the frames, verifying identification tags affixed to each penitent's wrist. The adept's movements were efficient, methodical, accompanied by the soft clicking of cogitator stylus against data slate. Behind the adept, a servitor held a brass bowl filled with small metal tokens. The tokens would replace the tags once intake was complete. Function codes instead of names. Purpose instead of identity. I scanned the faces below, searching for Harrow without fully understanding why. The observation gallery's acoustics were designed to carry sound upward. I could hear the hymns being recited by the penitents, a mandated devotional that lasted the duration of intake processing. The words were formulaic, drawn from the Lectitio Divinitatus, modified for this specific purpose. I am waste made holy. I am flesh awaiting function. I surrender, will that the Emperor's work may continue. I am grateful for correction. The voices blended into a murmur, individual words dissolving into collective sound. But one voice emerged with unusual clarity. A man's voice, younger than most, speaking faster than the prescribed cadence. He was in the 5th frame from the left, 2nd row. His face was turned upward, toward the observation window, though I doubted he could see through the one-way glass. Output above quota, he said, the words interrupting the hymn. 112% daily average, verified across all metrics. No disciplinary citations, no material waste, no... The Mechanicus adept approached without hurry. The servitor with the brass bowl followed. The adept consulted a data slate, then nodded once. The servitor extended a mechadendrite, and the man in the 5th frame fell silent, not violently. The silence was sudden and absolute, as though the capacity for speech had been extracted rather than suppressed. I checked my own data slate, cross-referenced the frame position with the intake roster. The identifier matched. Harrow, J. His productivity figures had been correct, 112%. The numbers did not lie, but the writ had declared inefficiency and the writ bore centuries of approval. The system had determined that something in Harrow's performance constituted waste, even if that waste exceeded the baseline expectations I had been trained to measure. The observation requirement specified a duration of 15 minutes. I remained at the window for the full period, watching the adept move from frame to frame, the servitor following with its bowl of replacement identities. When the 15 minutes elapsed, I returned to the lift. The processing continued below. It would continue for hours yet, systematic and thorough. I did not look back as the lift doors closed. The data reconciliation chamber occupied the eastern wing of the audit complex, a space dominated by rows of cogitator terminals arranged in perfect symmetry. Each terminal was attended by a lex mechanic or junior adept, their fingers moving across brass keys with practiced rhythm. The sound was percussive, almost musical, the click of keys, the hum of processors, the occasional chime when a verification sequence completed successfully. I took my assigned station and began the afternoon's primary task, cross-referencing servitorization writs against labor pool performance metrics. The work required precision but not creativity. Each writ contained a crime code. Each code corresponded to a specific range of performance deviation. My role was to ensure the numbers aligned, that no writ had been issued in error, that the system's internal logic remained consistent. The first 20 writs processed without incident. The crime codes matched expected deviations, substandard output, disciplinary infractions, material waste exceeding acceptable thresholds. The numbers told clear stories. These were corrections the system required, flesh that had failed to justify its continued autonomy. The 21st writ made me pause. Crime code 447.3, inefficiency, persistent. Labor output 117% of quota. I checked the code definition in the Administratum Manual of Categorical Offenses, 3rd edition, Amendment 71. The manual was 800 pages of densely printed text, each page laminated to prevent degradation. I had consulted it so many times that certain sections opened automatically to my touch. Code 447.3 was defined as consistent failure to meet minimum acceptable productivity standards across a period of no less than 30 standard days, resulting in measurable resource waste and disruption of optimized labor allocation. The definition assumed underperformance, but the metrics showed the opposite. I processed 3 more writs. All bore code 447.3. All showed output exceeding quota by margins ranging from 8 to 19%. A pattern was emerging, visible now that I had been forced to look. The highest performers were being flagged with the same frequency as the lowest. Not more frequently, but enough to be noticeable once the data was aggregated. I ran a secondary query, pulling records from the previous quarter. The pattern held. Workers who exceeded quota by more than 10% showed elevated servitorization rates compared to those who maintained steady performance within 2% of baseline. The catechism offered an explanation before I could fully formulate the question. Overperformance was a form of deviation. It suggested excessive initiative, the application of individual will rather than simple compliance with assigned function. A laborer who worked at exactly 100% demonstrated perfect alignment with imperial design. A laborer who exceeded that percentage was introducing variance, making choices, potentially disrupting the carefully calibrated efficiency that allowed the manufactorum to function as a single unified organism. The system was not punishing success, it was removing independence. I entered the correction into my audit log. The cogitator accepted it without comment. The numbers balanced. The writ was valid according to every metric the administratum recognized as authoritative. My training insisted this meant the writ was just. If the system could be trusted, and it had to be trusted, because without that trust, the entire edifice of imperial governance collapsed into arbitrary tyranny, then these conversions were necessary. They were mercy disguised as mathematics. I processed the remaining writs in my queue. 47 total, 32 showed the same pattern. By the time the evening bell rang, my hand ached from entering verification codes. The cogitator screen had left ghost images in my vision, green text floating across my peripheral sight even when I closed my eyes. I stood, joints protesting after hours of stillness, and prepared to conclude the day's cycle. A tech priest appeared at my station before I could leave. The priest's robes were red, edged with silver thread denoting senior rank within the Mechanicus hierarchy. The face beneath the hood was more metal than flesh, the jaw replaced entirely by augmetic components that clicked softly with each word. Lex Mechanic Auditor, 3rd class, the priest said, voice rendered flat by Vox synthesizer. Your verification codes have been logged. Enginsia Prime Vath requires your presence in Sanctification Chamber 7 for secondary audit confirmation. You will attend at the 22nd hour. The statement was not a request. I nodded compliance, and the priest departed without further acknowledgement. I had 3 hours before the appointed time. I used them to complete my devotional obligations, evening prayer in the auxiliary chapel, a brief meal of nutri-paste and recaf in the auditor's mess hall, and a review of the following day's projected workload. The routine was comforting. It created the illusion of control, the sense that my time was my own, even as every minute was prescribed by duty. The mess hall was nearly empty. Most auditors worked staggered shifts to ensure continuous oversight. I sat alone at a metal table, consuming my meal without tasting it. Across the hall, a servitor cleaned the floor with methodical precision, its mop moving in perfect geometric patterns. The servitor had been human once. I could tell by the proportions, by the slight asymmetry in its shoulders that suggested original bone structure beneath the augmetics. Its face was gone, replaced by a smooth dome of brass. No eyes, no mouth, only sensors that perceived dirt and calculated optimal cleaning trajectories. I wondered if it had been a laborer here, if it had stood in an intake queue, reciting hymns, waiting for the moment when identity became irrelevant. I wondered if it was grateful. The 22nd hour arrived with the inevitability of planetary rotation. Sanctification Chamber 7 was located adjacent to the conversion suites, close enough that I could hear the machinery through the walls, a low, rhythmic grinding punctuated by hydraulic hisses and the high whine of surgical tools engaging bone. Enginsia Prime Vath waited inside, surrounded by junior tech priests who attended to various ritual preparations. The chamber was circular, dominated by a raised platform at its center. On the platform rested a conversion frame, currently unoccupied. its restraints hanging open like waiting arms. The frame was magnificent in its own terrible way, a fusion of surgical precision and sacred geometry. Every component blessed and anointed, every surface inscribed with prayers in machine code. Vath's form was barely human. The Enginseer Prime had undergone extensive augmentation, sacrificing flesh in pursuit of unity with the machine god. 4 mechadendrites emerged from the back of the red robes, each tipped with different tools, surgical implements, data interface ports, anointing brushes. The face was a bronze mask, expressionless and eternal. "You have questions," Vath said. The voice emerged from a vox grill set into the mask's mouth, each word precisely modulated. "Your verification codes included hesitation markers. 0.7 seconds of delay on RIT 447, Theta 917. The delay suggests cognitive dissonance. I had not known my hesitation was measurable. The realization settled over me like a weight. Every action was monitored, every pause recorded. The system saw everything, measured everything, and found meaning in variations I had believed too small to matter. The writ was valid, I said. The verification was completed according to protocol. Protocol was satisfied, Vath agreed. But understanding remains incomplete. You will observe the benediction process. Comprehension will follow observation. The junior tech priests activated a series of mechanisms I did not fully understand. The chamber's temperature dropped sharply. Ventilation ports opened in the ceiling, drawing in air from the conversion suites beyond. The air carried scents I had learned to recognize: antiseptic solutions, sacred oils, the acrid tang of cauterized flesh, and beneath it all, the faint copper smell of blood rendered holy through purpose. A servitor entered from a side passage, escorting a penitent in gray robes. The penitent walked without resistance, head bowed, hands clasped in the sign of the Aquila. The servitor guided them to the platform and positioned them before the conversion frame. The restraints closed automatically, gentle but absolute. Vath approached, mechadendrites extending to perform a series of scans. Data flowed across a dozen screens arrayed around the chamber's perimeter: biological readouts, psychological profiles, skill assessments. The penitent's entire history reduced to streams of information that would determine which parts of their body could be repurposed and which would be discarded as inefficient. This one exceeded quota by 14%, Vath stated, though I had not asked. Labor classification, assembly, detailed component integration. The work required fine motor control and pattern recognition. Both skills demonstrate excessive neural activity. Initiative, the capacity to improve beyond instruction. The penitent did not react to this description. Perhaps they could not hear, perhaps they had already been chemically pacified, or perhaps they understood, and understanding had brought them to acceptance. Vath continued the blessing, anointing the penitent's forehead with sacred oils while reciting the litany of optimization. The words were in binary cant, beautiful and incomprehensible to my untrained ear. The junior tech priests responded in synchronized chorus, their voices blending into harmonic resonance. "You perceive contradiction," Vath said, interrupting the litany to address me directly. "Excellence punished, efficiency corrected. Your training has taught you that superior performance is virtue. The Mechanicus teaches that variance is inefficiency, regardless of direction. A manufactorum functions optimally when every component performs identically. Individual excellence creates dependency. It introduces fragility. If this one's output exceeds baseline by 14%, production quotas must account for that excess. When this one fails through illness, injury, or death, the shortfall becomes catastrophic. The system destabilizes. The explanation made sense according to the logic of machines. A manufactorum was not a collection of individuals. It was a single organism, each laborer a cell performing its designated function. Cells that grew beyond their prescribed size became tumors. Servitorization removes variance, Vath continued. It preserves valuable skills while eliminating the unpredictability of human will. This one's motor control will be retained. Pattern recognition will be optimized through neural pathway isolation. What is removed is choice. What remains is perfection. The restraints tightened. The penitent's breathing quickened, though their expression remained placid. Chemical compliance, then. The body's fear response continued even as the mind accepted necessity. I watched as the preliminary procedures began. The identification tags were removed first, replaced by a brass plate bearing a function code. M-class, detail assembly, neural pattern retained. The penitent's name disappeared into a waste receptacle. What had they been called? I realized I had not thought to check. The writ would have listed it, but I had focused on the numbers, on the crime code, on the mathematics of justification. The name was irrelevant now. In moments, the capacity to respond to any name would be gone. Vath's mechadendrites moved with practiced efficiency, preparing the neural interface points along the penitent's spine. Each insertion point was marked with a small tattoo of the Mechanicus cog, blessing the flesh that would soon be breached. The junior tech priests prepared the augmetic components, servo motors, neural shunts, chemical regulators. Each piece was a masterwork of sacred engineering, lovingly crafted and maintained across centuries of continuous use. "You will assist," Vath stated. It was not a question. One of the junior tech priests handed me a data slate and stylus. My role was simple: to confirm each stage of the process, to verify that the correct components were applied to the correct integration points, to ensure the ritual followed the prescribed sequence exactly. I was to be a witness with clerical responsibility. My signature would sanctify the conversion, adding one more layer of approval to the infinite chain of stamps and seals that stretched back through centuries. I accepted the data slate. The weight was familiar. I had held thousands of data slates across my service. This one felt no different. The first stage was cranial preparation. The penitent's scalp was shaved, treated with antiseptic, marked with incision guidelines. Vath recited the prayer of opening while the junior tech priests positioned surgical tools with reverent care. I watched the readings on the data slate, confirming vital signs remained stable, that the chemical pacification held, that the body accepted the coming transformation without resistance. A chime sounded. Stage 1 complete. I marked the confirmation on the data slate. The second stage involved neural mapping, probes inserted through the base of the skull, carefully navigating between vertebrae to access the spinal column. The penitent's body jerked once, involuntary reflex, before the pacification chemicals adjusted dosage automatically. The screens around the chamber displayed neural pathway diagrams, three-dimensional renderings of a mind reduced to measurable electrical impulses. Vath isolated the patterns associated with motor control and visual processing. These were valuable. These would be preserved, enhanced through direct augmetic interface. Everything else, memory, personality, the sense of self, was classified as unnecessary burden. It would be suppressed, not deleted entirely, but reduced to background noise beneath the weight of imperative function. Stage 2 complete, I confirmed. The third stage was integration. The augmetics were blessed individually before installation. Each component anointed and tested. Servo motors replaced muscles in the arms and hands. Optical sensors supplanted organic eyes, offering superior precision at the cost of emotional recognition. The penitent's face was covered with a bronze plate, smooth and featureless, a mercy that prevented the converted from seeing their own reflection and experiencing the dissonance of unrecognized identity. I confirmed each component. The data slate recorded my approval, time-stamped and encrypted, adding my voice to the eternal chorus that declared this transformation sacred and necessary. The fourth stage was activation. Power flowed through the newly installed systems. The servitor that had been a person moments before convulsed once as neural pathways realigned, as chemical regulators flooded the brain with compounds that enforced compliance at the biological level. Then stillness, perfect, absolute stillness. Vath issued a command in binary. The servitor stood, movements fluid and precise. It was beautiful, in the way that perfect machinery is beautiful. No hesitation, no wasted motion, pure function. Designation? Vath asked. The servitor responded immediately, voice rendered toneless by vocal cord modification. M-class, detail assembly, neural pattern retained. Unit 7743, Theta. Purpose? To serve, to function, to continue the Emperor's work without deviation. Vath turned to me. You understand now. The mercy is evident. Confusion has been removed. Suffering has ended. What remains is useful, eternal, and grateful. I wanted to agree. I wanted the understanding Vath promised to settle into certainty, but I kept seeing the moment of transition, the instant when the penitent's body had jerked, when some residual self had perhaps recognized what was being taken. The moment had lasted less than a second. It might have been purely physical, a nervous system responding to unexpected input without any cognitive awareness. But I could not stop seeing it. "Confirmed," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt in my hands. "The process is complete. The conversion is sanctified." Vath accepted this response without comment. The newly created servitor was led away to the assignment chambers, where it would be allocated to whichever production line required its specific skill set. The conversion frame was cleaned, blessed again, prepared for the next penitent who would arrive within the hour. I returned the data slate and departed the sanctification chamber. My shift had extended past the normal conclusion time, but overtime was expected during audit cycles. I made my way back to the auditor dormitories, a series of small cells arranged in efficient rows. My cell contained a cot, a small desk, a cabinet for personal effects. I owned very little. Possessions were discouraged. They suggested attachment to material concerns beyond duty. I lay on the cot without undressing. The mattress was thin, the frame metal. Comfort was sufficient for rest, but not for leisure. I closed my eyes and attempted to pray, to recite the evening devotional that would ease my mind into sleep. The words would not come. Instead, I kept hearing the servitor's voice, toneless and empty, declaring its purpose with the conviction of something that could no longer question whether that purpose had been chosen or imposed. I did not sleep well that night. The second day of the audit cycle began with the dawn bell, a sound that resonated through the manufactorum's entire structure. I rose, performed my ablutions, dressed in the grey robes of my station, and made my way to the morning prayer assembly. 200 auditors, lex mechanics, and junior adepts gathered in the primary chapel, a vast space beneath a ceiling painted with images of the emperor in his infinite forms. The prayer was led by an ecclesiastical confessor, a gaunt figure in robes of deep crimson. The confessor's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction, each word a hammer blow against doubt. "We are servants of the Imperium," the confessor intoned. "We are instruments of the Emperor's will. Our hands perform his work. Our eyes see his truth. Our voices speak his judgments. We are without ego. We are without hesitation. We are the machinery of faith made flesh." The assembly responded in unison. "We are blessed through service. We are holy through obedience. We are eternal through surrender." The catechism continued for 20 minutes, each verse reinforcing the fundamental truth of imperial existence. That individual will was the greatest enemy of collective survival. That choice was the luxury of the damned. That mercy existed only in the removal of burdens too great for mortal minds to bear. I recited the words with genuine feeling. I wanted to believe them. The alternative was to accept that I had witnessed something unforgivable the previous night, that I had participated in something my conscience could not reconcile with the idea of mercy I had been taught to cherish. After prayer, I returned to my station in the data reconciliation chamber. The cogitator terminal greeted me with a queue of new writs awaiting verification. I began processing them mechanically, confirming crime codes against performance metrics, ensuring the system's internal logic remained consistent. The pattern I had noticed yesterday continued. High performers flagged at elevated rates. The variance was subtle enough to be dismissed as statistical noise if one did not look carefully. But I was looking carefully now, unable to stop myself from seeing what I had been trained to overlook. 3 hours into my shift, an adeptus administratum overseer approached my station. The overseer was an older woman, her face lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from decades of managing other people's compliance. She carried a data slate and wore the expression of someone delivering routine news. "Lex Mechanic Auditor," she said. "Your verification rate has declined by 0.3% since yesterday. This deviation has been noted. You will increase processing speed to compensate by shift's end, or additional instruction will be required." The threat was mild, delivered without malice. Additional instruction meant extended shifts under direct supervision, a public acknowledgement of insufficient performance. It was not servitorization, I was too valuable in my current role, but it was humiliation, the kind of correction that ensured compliance through social pressure rather than mechanical intervention. "Understood," I said. "Compliance will be restored." The overseer nodded and moved on to the next station. I returned to my work, forcing myself to process faster, to spend less time on each writ, to trust the system rather than questioning the numbers that increasingly felt wrong. By midday, I had restored my verification rate to acceptable levels. The overseer returned, checked my output, and issued a curt nod of approval. The deviation was corrected. My record remained unblemished. I took my meal in the auditor's mess hall, consuming NutriPaste while reviewing the afternoon's workload on a portable data slate. Around me, other auditors ate in silence, their attention focused on their own tasks. Conversation was discouraged during meal periods. Time was too valuable to waste on social bonding. A servitor delivered recaf to my table, its movements so smooth I barely noticed its approach until the cup was placed before me. I looked up to thank it, an old habit, inappropriate but persistent, and found myself staring at the brass plate where its face should have been. M-Class, Detail Assembly, Neural Pattern Retained. Unit 7. 7. 4. 3. Theta. The servitor I had watched being created last night now served my meals. The transformation from observation to utility had taken less than 12 hours. The system's efficiency was breathtaking. I drank the recaf without tasting it. The afternoon brought a new requirement: physical inspection of the conversion suites themselves. This was rare, reserved for comprehensive audit cycles that examined every aspect of the manufactorum's operations. Most auditors never entered the suites. Their work was confined to data verification, to numbers rather than flesh. I was granted access because my audit cycle had been designated Comprehensive Category Alpha. The classification meant nothing to me when I received the assignment 3 days ago. Now, it felt like a sentence. The conversion suites occupied an entire substratum, accessible only through mag-locked doors that required biometric verification and prayer seal authorization. I presented my credentials to the Mechanicus sentry, a heavily augmented figure whose torso had been replaced by a weapon mount. The sentry scanned my identification, compared it against approved access lists, and opened the doors without comment. Beyond the doors, the air changed. It was colder, clinically sterile, saturated with antiseptic that burned the back of my throat. The lighting was harsh, industrial white, eliminating shadows entirely. Every surface was visible, every action exposed. The suites were arranged in parallel rows, each suite a self-contained theater for the transformation of flesh into function. Through reinforced glass windows, I could see tech priests and their servitor assistants performing procedures with ritualized precision. Some conversions were routine criminals undergoing mandatory servitorization as punishment for crimes against the Imperium. Others were voluntary, penitents seeking redemption through sacrifice of self. And others, I now understood, were neither punishment nor choice, but optimization. I walked the length of the corridor, data slate in hand, confirming that each suite met operational standards. The standards were technical: temperature regulation, tool sterilization, chemical inventory, disposal procedures for biological waste. I was not required to judge the morality of the procedures, only their efficiency. In Suite 12, I watched a penitent's vocal cords being removed. The procedure was delicate, performed by mechadendrites under magnification, each cut precise to the micron. The vocal cords were placed in a preservation jar, labeled for potential future use in voxogmetic production. Nothing was wasted. The penitent's mouth was open, frozen in what might have been a scream, though no sound emerged. Chemical pacification had already suppressed the capacity for voluntary vocalization. In Suite 17, a tech priest installed a cognitive inhibitor, a small device inserted directly into the frontal lobe. The inhibitor would prevent independent thought while preserving task-specific problem-solving abilities. The penitent would retain the ability to perform complex calculations, but lose the capacity to question why those calculations were necessary. In Suite 23, I saw a conversion fail. The penitent's body rejected the augmetics, immune system attacking the foreign components despite chemical suppression. Alarms sounded. Tech priests converged, attempting to stabilize vital signs. The effort lasted 4 minutes before being abandoned. The body was marked for recycling. The useful components would be salvaged. The rest would be rendered into protein paste for distribution to labor camps in the outer sectors. I confirmed each suite's operational status on my data slate. The work was numbing, deliberately so. The repetition created distance between observation and comprehension. I could watch these procedures without fully processing their meaning, as long as I focused on the technical requirements, on the measurements and specifications that reduced human transformation to engineering problems. But the distance was eroding. Each suite I inspected, each procedure I witnessed, brought me closer to a recognition I could not afford to acknowledge while still maintaining my faith in the system's fundamental benevolence. By the time I completed the inspection, my hands were shaking. Not from cold, though the suites were kept at temperatures barely above freezing. The shaking was involuntary, a physical manifestation of psychological stress my training had not prepared me to manage. I returned to my quarters an hour before my shift was scheduled to end, claiming mild illness. The overseer granted permission without investigation. Minor illness was acceptable. It demonstrated human weakness, a reminder that flesh was inherently flawed. I lay on my cot and stared at the ceiling, counting the rivets in the metal panels above me. 147 rivets, arranged in perfect geometric patterns. Everything in the Imperium followed patterns. Order was sacred. Chaos was the true enemy. But I kept thinking about the penitent in Suite 12, mouth frozen in a silent scream. I kept wondering if the pacification chemicals had truly suppressed awareness, or if they had only suppressed the ability to express it. If somewhere inside that silenced body, a self still existed, trapped and horrified, unable to scream, unable to die, forced to witness its own transformation into something useful, I prayed for the strength to stop wondering. The third day of the audit cycle began with a summons to the ecclesiastical sanctum, a chamber reserved for spiritual counseling and the correction of doctrinal deviation. The summons arrived before the dawn bell, delivered by a servitor that waited outside my quarters until I acknowledged receipt. The confessor, who had led morning prayer the previous day, waited inside the sanctum, seated behind a desk of dark wood carved with scenes from the lives of saints. The confessor's hands were folded atop the desk, fingers interlaced in the sign of contemplation. "Sit," the confessor said, gesturing to a simple stool opposite the desk. I sat. The stool was deliberately uncomfortable, designed to prevent relaxation during confession. "You have been observed," the confessor began. "Your work continues to meet technical standards. Your verification rate has been restored to acceptable levels, but your faith shows signs of strain. This strain is visible in your posture, in the duration of your prayers, in the quality of your attention during devotional assembly. You are performing the motions of faith without the conviction that gives them meaning." I wanted to deny this assessment, but denial would be transparent. The confessor had been trained to recognize the subtle markers of doubt. My only option was confession. "I have witnessed conversions," I said carefully. "I have seen the process by which flesh is transformed into function. The sight has troubled me." "Trouble is the first symptom of pride," the confessor replied, the words coming with the weight of ritual. "You assume your discomfort is evidence of moral clarity. You believe your feelings grant you superior insight into the Emperor's will. This is the most insidious form of heresy, the heresy of personal conscience elevated above collective wisdom." The accusation stung because it was accurate. I had been trusting my own reactions over the doctrines I had been taught, allowing visceral response to override theological certainty. The conversions I witnessed involved individuals who exceeded performance quotas, I said, the words emerging before I could consider whether speaking them was wise. Their crime was efficiency. Their punishment was optimization. The logic is consistent, but the mercy is. I could not finish the sentence. The confessor waited, allowing silence to grow heavy between us. "The mercy is invisible to you because you are measuring it incorrectly," the confessor said finally. "You perceive the removal of choice as cruelty, but choice is the burden that crushes mortal souls. Every decision carries the risk of error, of sin, of deviation from the Emperor's plan. Servitorization removes that risk. It grants eternal certainty. The servitor cannot fail because it cannot choose. It cannot sin because it cannot deviate. This is not punishment. This is salvation." The explanation was theologically sound. I had heard variations of it throughout my training. But hearing it now, after witnessing the silent scream in Suite 12, the words felt hollow. "They did not choose salvation," I said quietly. "They were selected for it." The confessor's expression hardened. "You speak as though choice has inherent value. Choice is what led to the Horus heresy. Choice is what allows corruption to enter loyal hearts. The Imperium survives because it removes choice from those too weak to bear it. You have been granted the privilege of choice because your station requires judgment. But that privilege is conditional. If you cannot exercise it without falling into pride, it will be removed for your own protection." The threat was clear. I was being offered a final opportunity to realign my thinking, to suppress doubt and embrace the catechism without reservation. If I failed, my next conversation would be with an inquisitorial representative, and those conversations rarely ended with the questioned individual returning to their previous duties. "I understand," I said. "My doubt is pride. My discomfort is selfishness. I will pray for strength to see the mercy I have been shown." The confessor studied my face for a long moment, searching for sincerity. I kept my expression neutral, revealing nothing. Finally, the confessor nodded. "You will perform additional devotional, 4 hours of prayer in the penitent chapel, beginning after your shift concludes. You will meditate on the litany of submission until its truth becomes self-evident. You will return tomorrow and report your progress. Am I understood?" "Yes, confessor." "Then go. Your audit cycle continues. The Emperor's work does not pause for individual crisis." I left the sanctum and returned to the data reconciliation chamber, arriving precisely on time for my shift. The cogitator greeted me with a new queue of writs. I processed them with mechanical efficiency, suppressing all thought except the technical requirements of verification. But throughout the day, a new awareness had settled into my mind, cold and undeniable. The system was designed to prevent exactly the kind of questioning I had begun to engage in. Every mechanism, doctrinal instruction, spiritual counseling, threat of reassignment existed to ensure compliance continued regardless of personal conviction. The Imperium did not require belief. It required behavior. And behavior could be enforced through social pressure, theological manipulation, and ultimately through the same procedures I had been verifying. I was not exempt from servitorization simply because I was an auditor. I was exempt only as long as my current function was deemed more valuable than whatever function my body could be optimized to perform. The recognition brought a kind of clarity, not peace, but understanding. I existed within a system that measured value purely in terms of utility, and utility was defined by those whose perspective encompassed scales I could not imagine. My individual conscience was irrelevant. My personal horror was a malfunction to be corrected. I could submit to correction, or I could continue to function while carrying the horror in silence. By the time my shift ended, I had decided to survive. The penitent chapel was located in the deepest sublevel of the manufactorum, a space rarely visited by anyone except those undergoing formal correction. The chapel was small, unadorned, lit by a single lumen strip that cast harsh shadows across stone walls. At the front of the chapel stood an altar bearing a simple aquila, unadorned brass, reflecting no light. I knelt on the stone floor and began the litany of submission. The words were familiar, recited thousands of times across my life. But tonight, they felt different. Tonight, they felt like a script I was performing, a role I was adopting for an audience that monitored every breath. I am nothing but what the Emperor requires. I have no will but what serves his purpose. I am blessed through obedience, holy through surrender. My thoughts are his thoughts, my actions, his actions. I am without self, without pride, without the burden of choice. Hours passed. My knees ached against the stone. My voice grew hoarse from constant recitation. But I continued, allowing the words to fill my mind, to drown out the images I could not escape, the silent scream, the brass plate where a face should have been, the servitor serving my meals with the precision of something that could no longer remember being human. Somewhere during the third hour, something shifted, not belief, not acceptance, but a kind of dissociation, a splitting of self into the part that performed and the part that observed the performance. I could recite the litany with conviction, while simultaneously acknowledging that the conviction was manufactured, a survival mechanism rather than genuine faith. The realization was both liberating and horrifying. I had learned to lie to myself convincingly enough that external observers could not detect the deception. I had become a servitor of sorts, performing my designated function while the self that doubted remained hidden beneath layers of procedural compliance. When the 4 hours concluded, I rose from the stone floor and departed the chapel. My legs barely supported my weight. I made my way back to my quarters, moving through corridors emptied by the late hour. Servitors cleaned the floors, their movements synchronized, their presence nearly invisible. I passed one servitor, M-Class, Detail Assembly, Neural Pattern Retained, Unit 7743, Theta, and wondered if somewhere beneath the brass plate, beneath the chemical compliance and neural inhibitors, a fragment of the person who had been Harrow still existed. If that fragment was aware, if it was suffering, if mercy had truly been granted, or if mercy was simply the word we used to justify the unjustifiable. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I lay on my cot and listened to the manufactorum's endless machinery, the grinding and hissing that never ceased, the sound of the Imperium's appetite consuming flesh and transforming it into function. The final day of the audit cycle began with a notification that my work had attracted favorable attention. The overseer delivered the news with rare approval, informing me that Enginseer Prime Vath had submitted a commendation noting my thorough verification procedures and my willingness to observe conversion processes directly. The commendation was a test. I understood this immediately. By praising my thoroughness, Vath was establishing a record of my enthusiasm for the very procedures I had begun to question. If I later expressed doubt, the commendation would serve as evidence of dishonesty, proof that my concerns were recently acquired and therefore suspect. I accepted the commendation with appropriate humility and returned to my station. The final day's work involved comprehensive summary reporting, aggregating 3 days of verification into a single document that would be submitted to the Adeptus Administratum for permanent archival. The numbers told their story with brutal clarity. During this audit cycle, 217 individuals had been processed for servitorization. Of these, 143 bore crime codes associated with underperformance or material waste. 74 bore codes associated with overperformance or excessive initiative. The ratio was deliberate. The system maintained balance by removing both extremes, creating a workforce that performed exactly as specified without deviation in either direction. Excellence was as dangerous as failure. Both suggested the presence of individual will. I compiled the report with meticulous attention to detail, ensuring every figure was accurate, every verification properly documented. The report would become part of the eternal record, consulted by future auditors conducting their own cycles, perpetuating the same patterns across centuries. As I finalized the document, a message appeared on my cogitator screen. Report to Cognitive Integrity Assessment Chamber, 19th hour. Attendance mandatory. The Cognitive Integrity Assessment was the final stage of comprehensive audit cycles, a procedural review ensuring auditors had not been psychologically compromised by extended exposure to conversion processes. The assessment was framed as protective, a safeguard against trauma. In practice, it was a mechanism for identifying and correcting deviant thinking before it could manifest as actionable resistance. I had 7 hours before the appointed time. I used them to complete my summary report, to perform afternoon devotional, to consume my final meal of the cycle. Every action was correct. Every moment accounted for. I gave no external indication of the hollow dread that had settled in my chest. The assessment chamber was clinical, furnished with a single chair facing a panel of 3 assessors, a Mechanicus tech priest, an ecclesiarchal confessor, and an Adeptus Administratum senior auditor. Each represented a different facet of imperial authority. Together, they formed a tribunal capable of determining my fitness for continued service. I sat in the chair. The interrogation began. "You have completed a comprehensive audit cycle," the Administratum auditor began, voice neutral. "Your performance has been satisfactory. Your verification accuracy exceeds minimum standards. However, several markers suggest psychological strain. You will answer questions honestly. Deception will be detected and classified as evidence of corruption." "I understand," I said. The confessor leaned forward. During your observations in the conversion suites, did you experience doubt regarding the righteousness of servitorization? The question was a trap. Admitting doubt would trigger correction. Denying it would be provably false, given the records of my extended prayers and my conversation in the ecclesiastical sanctum. I experienced discomfort, I said carefully. The procedures are difficult to witness, but discomfort is not doubt. It is human weakness, the reaction of flesh confronted with the Emperor's necessary severity. The confessor's expression did not change. Explain the distinction you draw between discomfort and doubt. Discomfort is emotional, doubt is theological. I felt horror watching conversions, but I did not question their necessity. My emotions are flawed, the Emperor's logic is perfect. I pray to align the former with the latter. The tech priest's mechadendrites twitched, processing my response through analytical frameworks I could not perceive. Your verification rate declined by 0.3% during the second day of your cycle. Analysis suggests this decline correlates with increased cognitive processing time per writ. You were thinking rather than processing. Explain this deviation. I noticed a pattern in the data. I admitted, choosing honesty because the records would reveal the lie otherwise. High-performing laborers were flagged for servitorization at rates comparable to underperformers. The pattern troubled me until I understood its purpose. Variance in either direction disrupts systemic optimization. The system corrects both extremes to maintain stability. You now accept this correction as necessary? The administratum auditor asked. I accept it as inevitable, I said. The Imperium's survival depends on predictability. Individual excellence creates dependencies that introduce fragility. Servitorization removes that fragility. The three assessors exchanged glances, a silent communication I could not interpret. The tech priest spoke first. Your understanding is technically accurate. However, your emotional response remains misaligned. You comprehend the logic, but have not achieved peace with it. This suggests incomplete integration of imperial doctrine. The confessor nodded agreement. You speak the correct words, but they do not yet reside in your heart. Faith must be absolute, not performative. You are performing faith while harboring unresolved horror. I am trying to resolve it, I said, allowing genuine desperation to enter my voice. I pray constantly. I meditate on the catechisms. I want to believe without reservation, but the images persist. I cannot unsee what I have witnessed. Then you must see more, the tech priest stated. Exposure creates desensitization. You will be temporarily reassigned to the conversion annex, assisting directly in servitorization procedures. Duration: 7 standard days. At the conclusion of this period, you will undergo reassessment. If your integration remains incomplete, more permanent correction will be applied. The sentence was delivered without malice. It was procedural, mechanical, the system's method for resolving a detected malfunction. I would either learn to accept servitorization through participation, or I would become a servitor myself, the irony apparently lost on my assessors. I accept this assignment, I said, because refusal was not an option that led to continued existence. The confessor stood. You are dismissed. Report to Conversion Annex, Station Gamma. At the commencement of next shift cycle, Enginseer Prime Vath will provide detailed instruction. May the Emperor grant you clarity. I departed the assessment chamber and returned to my quarters. The 7th day had concluded. My comprehensive audit cycle was complete. The summary report had been submitted. My regular duties would resume after the reassignment period, if I survived it. I lay on my cot, counting rivets again, trying to find comfort in geometric patterns, but the numbers blurred. I kept seeing the silent scream, kept imagining my own face replaced by a brass plate, kept wondering if the person I was now would be completely erased, or if some fragment would persist, trapped and aware, forced to witness my own hands performing procedures I had once found horrifying. Sleep did not come. Instead, I prayed. Not the formal litanies, but a formless plea to the Emperor, to the universe, to whatever mercy might still exist in a galaxy that had long ago replaced compassion with efficiency. I prayed that when they took me apart, they would be thorough, that nothing would remain to remember what I had been. That mercy, at least, seemed possible. The conversion annex occupied a wing of the manufactorum I had never entered, accessible only to Mechanicus personnel and those specifically assigned to assist in sacred procedures. The corridors here were narrower, the air thick with incense that could not quite mask the underlying sense of antiseptic and flesh. Servo skulls drifted through the passages, recording everything, their eye lenses tracking movement with tireless attention. I reported to Station Gamma at the appointed hour, wearing the grey robes of an audit assistant, stripped of rank insignia. For the next 7 days, I was not a Lex Mechanic auditor. I was a participant. My role reduced to physical assistance and observation, so close that distance became impossible. Engine Seer Prime Vath waited at the station, surrounded by the surgical mechanisms of conversion. The Engine Seer's bronze mask reflected the harsh lumens, expressionless and absolute. "You will observe first," Vath stated. "Then you will assist. Then you will perform portions of the procedure under supervision. The progression is designed to eliminate residual horror through familiarity. By the 7th day, you will understand that this work is mercy made manifest." The first conversion began immediately. A penitent was brought forward, already chemically pacified, eyes distant and unfocused. The crime code was read aloud, code 581.2, material waste through perfectionist delay. The penitent had been a quality inspector, someone whose attention to detail had slowed production by identifying flaws others would have overlooked. Vath explained the procedure in clinical detail, narrating each step as though instructing a student. The penitent's skull was opened with precision tools that cauterized as they cut, preventing blood loss. The brain was exposed, glistening and vulnerable, the physical seat of consciousness rendered visible and manipulable. "The frontal lobe will be partially ablated," Vath explained. "Decision-making centers will be suppressed. Quality assessment skills will be retained but isolated, accessible only through direct mechanical command. The subject will be able to identify flaws but will lack the capacity to delay production. Precision without discretion." I watched as mechadendrites inserted neural shunts, tiny devices that would regulate thought like valves controlling fluid flow. The penitent's body remained still throughout, chemical compliance ensuring no resistance. When the procedure concluded, the servitor was activated. It stood, movements precise, and was immediately subjected to testing. A component with deliberate flaws was presented. The servitor identified each flaw within seconds, cataloging them with mechanical efficiency. Then the component was removed, and the servitor forgot it had ever existed. No lingering concern. No desire to correct the problems identified. Pure assessment without the burden of caring about outcomes. Successful conversion, Vath declared. Perfection achieved. The second day, I was instructed to hold instruments, to position tools within Vath's reach, to verify readings on monitoring equipment. My hands shook at first, but Vath did not comment on this. Shaking was expected. It would pass. The penitent that day had exceeded production quotas by 17%. Crime code 447.3. Inefficiency. Persistent. I knew the pattern now. Overperformance suggested initiative, the application of problem-solving skills beyond simple task completion. The system would preserve the skills, but remove the drive that generated them. I watched my hands assist in opening the cranial cavity. I watched my fingers steady the neural probe as it descended into brain tissue. I watched myself become complicit in ways that could not be rationalized as distant or abstract. During the third day's procedure, the penitent was a woman who had volunteered for servitorization. Genuinely volunteered, seeking redemption for some sin she believed unforgivable. Her eyes were lucid until the chemical compliance took effect, and in those final moments of awareness, I saw something that might have been relief. This disturbed me more than the forced conversions. The idea that servitorization could be genuinely desirable, that existence could become so unbearable that the removal of self seemed merciful. By the fourth day, I no longer shook. My hands moved with learned precision, anticipating Vath's requirements before they were spoken. The procedures had become routine, steps in a sequence I could perform without conscious thought. Vath noted my progress with approval. Desensitization is proceeding optimally. You are learning that horror is merely unfamiliarity. Repeat exposure reveals the sacred logic beneath initial revulsion. On the fifth day, I was permitted to perform a minor procedure myself, the removal of vocal cords from a penitent designated for labor servitor conversion. The procedure was delicate, requiring steady hands and precise cuts. I performed it flawlessly, placing the vocal cords in the preservation jar, labeling them for future use. The penitent's mouth remained open throughout, frozen in that position by paralytic compounds. I tried not to imagine what they might be screaming if sound were possible. The sixth day brought a complication. A penitent's body rejected the neural shunts, immune response triggering cascade failure despite chemical suppression. Vath attempted corrective measures, but the biological systems were collapsing too rapidly. Within minutes, the penitent was dead. Brain function ceased, body cooling on the conversion frame. Vath displayed no frustration, no regret. Rejection occurs in approximately 3% of conversions. Unfortunate but acceptable. The components will be salvaged. The protein matter will be recycled. Total waste, minimal. The body was removed by servitors and replaced by the next penitent within 10 minutes. The procedure continued without pause. One failure did not halt the sacred work. On the seventh day, I performed a complete conversion under Vath's supervision. The penitent was a young man, barely 20 standard years, convicted of asking questions during labor shift code 239.8, unauthorized inquiry disrupting productivity. I opened his skull. I inserted the neural shunts. I activated the chemical regulators. I watched his eyes dim as the self that asked questions was suppressed beneath layers of mechanical imperative. When I activated the servitor, it stood without hesitation and recited its designation with perfect, toneless clarity. Vath declared the conversion successful. You have completed the training cycle. You understand now that servitorization is not cruelty, but optimization. You have performed the Emperor's mercy with your own hands. Report to reassessment tomorrow. I returned to my quarters that evening, hands clean, robe spotless, record unblemished. I had become proficient in the dismantling of human consciousness. I had learned to perform these procedures without visible emotional response. But what I had not learned, what I would never learn, was to believe they were mercy. I had simply learned to lie more convincingly, to split myself so completely that the part performing the procedures felt nothing, while the part that still remembered horror remained buried so deep it could not surface without destroying the fragile equilibrium keeping me functional. I had become a kind of servitor myself, not through augmentation, but through psychological necessity. The self that had questioned was suppressed. What remained was a mechanism that processed writs, verified numbers, and assisted in conversions without the burden of moral conflict. The next morning, I underwent final reassessment. The same 3-member tribunal evaluated my progress. I answered their questions with calm certainty, explaining that repeated exposure had revealed the sacred logic of servitorization, that I no longer experienced horror but only understanding. The confessor studied my face for signs of deception. The tech priest analyzed my physiological responses. The administratum auditor reviewed my performance records. After 30 minutes of evaluation, they reached their conclusion. You have achieved acceptable integration, the administratum auditor stated. Your cognitive functioning remains optimal. Your faith has been restored through corrective exposure. You will return to standard audit duties. This incident will be recorded as resolved. I was dismissed. I departed the assessment chamber and returned to the data reconciliation facility, taking my seat at the familiar cogitator terminal. The screen greeted me with a new queue of writs awaiting verification. I began processing them with mechanical efficiency, confirming crime codes, verifying numbers, applying my seal to documents that would transform human beings into sacred mechanisms. The work continued. The bells rang their familiar cadence. Servitors moved through the corridors with perfect synchronization. The manufactorum's machinery ground on without pause, consuming flesh and producing function in ratios that had been calculated centuries ago by minds convinced they were performing the Emperor's will. I signed the writs. I confirmed the verifications. I assisted in conversions when required. And somewhere beneath the procedural compliance, beneath the learned desensitization, beneath the survival mechanism that allowed me to continue functioning, a fragment of the person who had first pressed a seal onto Harrow's writ remained aware aware that the system was designed to prevent questioning by making questioners complicit, aware that mercy was the word we used to disguise systematic erasure, aware that I had been given a choice between complicity and conversion, and that choosing complicity meant I would spend the rest of my existence facilitating the very procedures I had once found unforgivable. But awareness changed nothing. The system did not require my belief, it required only my behavior, and my behavior was compliant. Months passed, years accumulated. I processed thousands of writs, verified countless conversions, and rose through the ranks of the administratum through demonstrated efficiency and unwavering devotion to duty. I became senior auditor, then chief lex mechanic, then compliance overseer for an entire subsector of manufactorums. My authority expanded, my responsibilities grew, and with each promotion, I moved further from the direct witness of conversion procedures, returning to the comfortable distance of numbers and verification codes. But I never forgot. The memory of that first audit cycle remained preserved with perfect clarity, a wound that never healed, existing in parallel to the functional self that performed the Emperor's work without hesitation. I trained new auditors in proper verification procedures. I taught them the catechisms of efficiency and the sacred logic of systemic optimization. I watched them undergo the same progression I had experienced: initial horror, growing numbness, eventual acceptance achieved through either genuine belief or performative compliance. I could not tell which category I belonged to anymore. The distinction had ceased to matter. Some nights, I dreamed of servitors. Thousands of them, arranged in perfect rows, brass faces reflecting nothing. And in the dream, I could hear them, not with ears, but with some deeper perception. They were screaming, all of them, a chorus of silenced voices, screaming eternally without sound, awareness trapped inside mechanisms designed to prevent its expression. But when I woke, I told myself it was only a dream, that chemical compliance and neural suppression prevented suffering, that the mercy was real, even if I could not feel it. I told myself this because the alternative, accepting that I had spent my entire career facilitating conscious torture on an industrial scale, was incompatible with continued sanity. So I functioned, I performed, I complied. The system had not broken me through conversion. It had broken me through complicity, and in the Imperium of Man, where survival itself is a form of heresy against human dignity, that distinction meant nothing at all. The manufactorum continued its work, the writs continued to arrive, the conversions proceeded without pause, and I continued to sign the documents that made them possible, one seal at a time, until the day my own efficiency declined enough to warrant correction. On that day, I suspect, I will walk to the intake queue without resistance. I will recite the hymns of surrender. I will accept the restraints with the calm of someone who has always known this outcome was inevitable. And when the brass plate covers my face, when the neural shunts suppress the fragment that still remembers horror, perhaps what remains will finally achieve the peace the Imperium has promised all along. The peace of function without thought, the peace of purpose without choice, the peace of serving without the burden of knowing what service costs. Until then, I endure, I comply. I continue the Emperor's work with hands that no longer shake, processing flesh into function with the efficiency of something that stopped questioning whether efficiency and mercy could ever truly mean the same thing. The bells ring, the machinery grinds, the writs arrive, and I sign them, one after another, sealing fates I once believed were merciful, knowing now that mercy is simply the word we use when we lack the courage to call horror by its name.